Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director and bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Vanessa Veselka in support of ZAZEN and in conversation this evening with Liberty Hardy. If you're just joining us, just a reminder that the chat is closed this evening, but that you can use the chat, you can keep the chat window open rather. So I'll be sharing links to purchase ZAZEN from our store throughout the event. As well, the Q&A feature is available to you at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions at any time, and I will ask a selection of your questions on your behalf at the conclusion of the conversation. Live transcription is also available to you on your toolbar as well. Should you need subtitles, there's a CC icon for closed captioning. And if you're watching us later on our YouTube channel, thank you for doing so. There are always links to purchase books right in the description below me. You can always like and subscribe to be kept up to date on all of our events when they become available on our YouTube channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Vanessa Veselka is the author of the novel The Great Offshore Grounds, which was longlisted for the National Book Award. Her debut novel, ZAZEN, won the 2012 Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her short stories have appeared in Tin House and others in her nonfiction, and GQ, The Atlantic Smithsonian, was included in the Best American Essays in the anthology Bitchfest, 10 Years of Cultural Criticism. She has been, at various times, teenage runaway, sex worker, union organizer, musician, a train hopper, a waitress, and a mother. She lives in Portland, Oregon. And she's joined this evening in conversation by Liberty Hardy, a senior contributing editor for Book Riot and host of the popular All the Books podcasts. She lives in the great state of Maine, where she reads 500 to 600 books a year and hangs out with her 3 cats who hate to read. Please join me in welcoming Vanessa Veselka and Liberty Hardy into your living rooms.
Vanessa, hello.
Hi, Liberty. How you doing?
It's so great to see you.
It's great to see you too. Welcome to the hotel room I'm in. And you'll see me shifting. Everybody will see me shifting around.
Welcome to the time zone.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I was fully expecting you to be like, I don't know, well, it would be like 3 o'clock in Portland right now, I think.
Right.
The other Portland, as we call it here in Maine.
That's right. That's right.
So you were going to read to us from ZAZEN, but I was wondering if you would humor me for like 1 second and allow me to remind you of the first time that we met, because I don't know if you remember, and I'm kind of amazed that I remember. But it was in 2010 that I got a galley of ZAZEN from Richard Nash, and it blew my mind. I mean, I was like, I cannot wait until this book comes out. I talked about it on Twitter like every day. I'm sure people were like, okay, enough. But I was just so obsessed with this book. And for BEA in 2011, I decided to go down for the day to get a galley of the new Colson Whitehead. And I was invited to a party that night. But unfortunately, on my trip down to BEA that year, in this freak accident, I had my front tooth knocked out. And I had to stay in New York for the night because I didn't have a ride back. And so I got invited to this party, and someone told me that you were going to be there. And I was like, so excited, but I was like, I can't meet her because 1, I'm terrified of meeting people who I admire. And 2, I was missing my front tooth and I was so embarrassed. But then after 4 beers, I remember like going right up to you and being like, I love you. I love your book. Look at my missing tooth. Tell me everything about you. And it was amazing. And you were so kind. And you showed me your tattoo that you had recently got of your ISBN number of your book. And you answered all my questions. And I just was mortified on the ride home the next day, of course. But I just have always thought of that moment fondly because I'm kind of glad I had those beers because I wouldn't have met you if I hadn't. So anyway, thank you for listening to my story. And now we are going to hear a little bit from your awesome novel.
Thank you. Oh, I really love the story. That's quite exciting to me. I remember parts of it, but I remember you talking about your tooth, but I don't remember actually seeing or noticing your tooth. I know a lot of people who've lost teeth in general. And so I may not spook as easily as other people around the tooth loss spectrum. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning and then a couple short things. This is the pretty new cover.
It's amazing.
I just thought I'd show that. I went to work and a guy I wait on said he was leaving. He said everyone he knew was pulling out. Canada's just not far enough. Mostly Mexico, a bunch to Thailand, some to Bali. He always orders a tofu scramble, makes me write a fucking essay to the cook. No soy sauce in the oil mix, no garlic, no extra tomato, no green pepper, add feta, potatoes crispy, and when are we going to get spelt? He holds me personally responsible for his continued patronage. I hope he dies. I'd like to read about it. My brother Credence says that people who leave are deluding themselves about what's out there. I just think they're cowards. Mr. Tofu Scramble says I should go anyway, that it's too late. I want to, but I can't. Maybe when the bombs stop or at least let up, nobody thinks it'll stay like this. I call it a war, but Credence says it isn't one yet. Not yet. I say they just haven't picked a day to market it, soft opens being all the rage. My last few weeks at grad school, it was so bad, I thought everything was going to shake itself apart. I tried to focus on my dissertation, follow the diaspora of clamshells, but every night it got worse. It's not any better here. Here, there, now, tomorrow, next Wednesday. Geologically speaking, it's all the same millisecond. The gentle rustle of armies crawling the planet like ants. Anybody with any sense knows what's coming. I was in yoga yesterday and this girl started crying. Raina, who teaches on Mondays, went over and put her hands on the girl like a faith healer. She closed her eyes and let the girl cry while she breathed. Everyone was watching like they were going to see sparks or something. I was anyway. I would have liked that. The girl calmed down. Her breath was hard and her eyes were swollen, and Raina began to talk about being okay with how you find yourself on the mat. And I thought, there's nobody here who's okay with that. If you took off the roof, we'd all just look like little gray worms. I looked at the girl crying and I was glad it wasn't me. Credence says, if half the privileged white marketing reps in my yoga class, voted for something other than reductions in their property taxes, something might actually happen. I'd like to see something happen. Something big that wasn't scary, just beautiful. Some kind of wonderful surprise like how fireworks used to feel. Because now I'm no better than a dog. Still, there is something true in that yoga manifestation thing because I feel different when I believe different things. Only I don't know how to go back to feeling how I did because I don't know how to go and re-believe. When the first box mall church went up in the blackberry field, I wanted some kind of rampant mass stigmata with blackberry juice for blood. It didn't happen. It's not going to. They win. They just pave, roll, drive over everything that's beautiful. Babies, love, and small birds. And on summer nights with the windows open, I hear joints cracking like crickets. I wake up sometimes and feel the nearness of something, but then it's gone, and I've started to wonder if it was ever there. Lately, I've become afraid that the feeling I used to feel, like something good was waiting, is what people mean when they say young. And it's nothing more than a chemical associated with a metabolic process and not anything real at all. I waited on Mr. Tofu Scramble. He had a date at lunch and they both ordered blackberry smoothies, vegan. And I thought about slipping his date a note telling her that he was a big old cheese eater when she wasn't around, but who am I to stand in the way of love? Even Credence fell in love and got married, although I think he secretly wants a medal for falling in love with a black woman. Our parents were so proud. Now, if I could only abandon my heterosexual tendencies as uninvestigated cultural preconditioning and move in with some sweet college-educated lipstick lesbian bike mechanic, they could all finally die happy. I've lived with Credence and Annette for almost 3 months now. And at first I thought that because Annette was black, I was never supposed to get mad at her. I acted like I was living with an exchange student who spoke English really well. Jean-Pierre, what do they call baseball in France? Annette. Do you like macaroni and cheese? Daisuke, how is the rebuilding going? Credence has a missionary belief in community organizing. He says grassroots the way Bible thumpers say, Jesus, hallelujah. Credence and I stopped the Walmart from opening once. It was earlier in the year and it lasted for about a minute. 4 months of door-to-door organizing, leafleting, town meetings, petitions, land use hearings, senators' phone calls, cold free donuts, sermons to the choir in the rain with balloons whipping around our faces in the wind while we chant and people drive by in heated sedans, look confused. Take pictures and then send them out to all the people who couldn't come to the rally. And it worked for about a minute. It's hard to do the same thing twice. It's hard to feel the same way you did, especially when you really want to. We just set them back a couple of months on their timeline. I moved in with Credence and Annette the week of Walmart's grand opening. That was back in May when we found out Annette was pregnant. They said I could stay until the twins were born. They gave me the attic. It has dormer windows and a leaky skylight. And when I go to sleep there, I stare up through the glass and I try to pretend that none of us are here. Out of a desire to understand, I began collecting maps and putting them on the walls. Gift shop maps with sea monsters on them, beveled unfamiliar coastlines, Cold War maps with the Soviet menace, spreading like leprosy, pink, East Germany, red China. Maps of Pangaea and Gondwanaland back from before the seams pulled apart, when we were all still one big continent. Deep time, where countries turn to silt and silt turns to stone, and we can now tell time by comparing the rates of nations collapsing. Biostratigraphy, patriostratigraphy. Following the law of superposition, one thing follows another. Map of Trail of Tears, a bike map, a subway map, and one I drew when I was 12 and wrote Della's World in scented marker across the top. Historical, geological, topographical, ideological, and imaginary. Sitting in Credence's attic, I tried to figure out if culture was just geology. Maybe Rwanda was caused by mountain building and the Russo-Japanese War by glacial till. And maybe you need pirated rivers in the headlands before you can have a Paris commune. I found a picture online of a man setting himself on fire. It didn't say where he was or what he was protesting. Next to his leg was a gas can. He must have just dropped the match because I could still see his clothing. His arms were raised and flailing, and I thought of the Buddhists who can sit quiet as well water and burn like candles. Like that famous photo where the Zen monk is sitting cross-legged on fire in the middle of an intersection while cars drive past and people watch. Everything near him is blurry. The cars, the people, because they're moving. He is absolutely still. Everything around him is sharp. Every detail of his robe, his eyelids, and the oil smoke, it's all absolutely clear because he is absolutely still. I first saw the picture in high school and I remember telling Credence about it. On fire? On fire, I said. You'd have to move. They don't move. Della, like I was doing it on purpose. Della, their bodies would make them move. They'd have to. His voice thinned and climbed. It's biological, he squealed. They wouldn't have any control over it. In 1969 in Prague, it took Jan Palach 3 days to die because he wasn't trained to just sit there. It was like Credence said, it was biological. After I found the photo of the blazing man with the flailing arms, I began to look for eyewitness accounts of people setting themselves on fire. Hell, I figured if you can't trust some hand-me-down, unverifiable, anonymous hearsay, what can you trust? There were more of them than I thought. There was one yesterday. He set himself on fire to protest a recommendation from a subcommittee to legislate a 3% quota on alternate grain production. There were Americans dancing around like sparklers on the 4th of July. There were Basque nationalists, German priests, Taiwanese publishers. One entry in Wikipedia said that Kathy Change self-immolated to protest, quote, the present government and economic system and the cynicism and passivity of the people, end quote. And underneath the afterthought, quote, MIT student Elizabeth Shin may have committed suicide in the same manner, end quote. One self-immolator was described as disgruntled. Following other names were comments like supposedly for the same reason. I started putting them on the walls too. I bought a bag of fortune cookies and rated the fortunes, and on the back of each I wrote underneath their lucky numbers in red, the name of the burned. So I'm gonna stop there for a second. I'm gonna read a little bit more later, but
Sure.
it gives you a sense of Della as she comes into the book.
Yeah. So to just go over it a little bit, she's in her 20s.
Mm-hmm.
She has just received her PhD in geology. She's living with her brother, Credence, and his wife, Annette, and she's expecting twins, or the bellyfish, as they're referred to, which I absolutely love. Sleeping in their attic and working at a vegan restaurant. And she's worried about a lot. And she's worried, like she literally screams on public transit when she hears about a bombing. And I love that she has these maps, because you kind of feel like Della is lost, and she's surrounding herself with maps. And she's also completely fascinated, as you were saying, by people who have self-immolated. And later, like, she's such an interesting character because she's so concerned about everything, and yet later she starts calling in bomb threats. Like, she starts making bomb threats. And one of the lines that because I read this a million times, 10 years ago, and when I was rereading this recently, one of the lines that I could almost remember without even looking at it, but now I'm going to have to, is walking home, it occurred to me, the great thing about a bomb threat is how much it leaves to the imagination. Like your mom saying you're in trouble, but not telling you why. You go over everything. It could be in your mind. There were hidden rivers of guilt under there. There had to be. Like, she's gone from being worried about everything, because, like, I'll back it up by saying, like, at this point in time in the book, America is a hot mess. Spoiler, America is always a hot mess, but it's its own particular kind of hot mess in this book. There's War A and War B. There are bombs going off all over the place, and people are leaving America for other countries. And she's nervous, and she's having a hard time. And, she's just, there's so much going on. There's so much in this novel. It's so many different things. It's like, it's punk rock, it's dystopian, it's a family drama. It talks about capitalism. It says so much about capitalism and consumerism, cultural appropriation, virtue signaling, domestic terrorism, grief. It's amazing. I'm just fangirling out now. So I'm going to ask you, what inspired you to write it? I had heard that it was originally a short story and then was turned into a novel. And I was wondering if that was a difficult transition and how long you spent working on it.
So, I was, I'm trying to think about how intimate I want to be about some of this. I started writing ZAZEN as a short story, but I had worked on I'd written one short story before it. And I may have written a second, but the first one had been published. I had written a second. The first one had been published. And then the second one I'd sent to Tin House, and I got this note back from them that was like, it made it like all the way up, but then not quite, right? And they sent me this lovely note about like, we really love your stuff, and like, this one doesn't quite do it for us, but please send us things in the future. And I think 2 days before that, I'd started writing this short story of ZAZEN, which was just, it's Della's voice. I mean, everything in that novel is driven by her voice. And from the first, what's on the first pages is those were the first things I wrote. And her voice just drove. And what I found in it was a different part of me, which I didn't realize it, but I was always translating the way my mind naturally worked about things into something that was more manicured. And when Della came as a character, she really is a character. It's not really me. When Della emerged as a character in that voice, it was like a character that no longer cared, that was renaming everything into her own world. And because she does, there's Colony of the Elect Boulevard, which is really Heritage Avenue. Talk about gentrification, but like there's all these ways she names stuff through the book. She's completely remapping and renaming the world she's in. And this was a character that like didn't care how much, which was also like, well, readers might not like some of that. They might not be able to tell what you're talking about, crazy lady. But there was such a drive to it that I just went on the ride. And so, the poor people from Tin House had been like, yeah, you got promise, send something later. And I was like, how about now? I just sent them ZAZEN like the day they asked, unedited and everything. And they took it. Right. So, So it was the first time, that was, I finished, they took it. I didn't do much editorial on it. And I was like, well, that's that, except for I could not stop writing the story. I literally just picked up at the end of it and kept writing. And I was angry at the time because I had a different first novel planned. I had an idea of what I was going to write for a first novel, and this was not it. And I was going to do another like 5 or 6 short stories and, build up and get, like I had a whole plan on what it was like to approach a first novel. And this taught me that like, you don't need any of those plans. You just sit down and start writing the novel you want to write. And so I felt hijacked by her voice quite a bit. Like I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't ready to do that right now. And it just, but it was like being on a train. Yeah, so that's how the writing came about for me. And I don't plan things out, as I write very, I free write into what I'm doing. And then, so I have also that experience over and over of writing something and then going, oh, it's about that, and it's just sort of like every time it's like sinks a little deeper into the emotional experience of how I imagine the world. And so, so I think also writing towards the end of that book, knowing that I'll just say this now, there were multiple possible endings to that book. There was the Fight Club ending, blow everything up and like, whatever. There was the I fall in love and live and happy, kind of Della ending. There was the come to appreciate the little things, there was a million from, sci-fi to saccharine to, more well-balanced adulthood to whatever. There were all these endings and none of them were going to work. And so as I was sort of like barreling towards the end of this book, I knew that the endings that I could do were just getting cut off every, that was like cutting off possibilities and I had no idea how I was going to end it. So, I've come to trust that process and really like it. And it didn't let me down, but, I think the whole movement in the book is she's asking the question, how can I sit still on fire? She's asking the question, what's to be done? And ultimately she's asking a very different question, which is, are you in or are you out? And that was the thing that helped me understand the ending, which you didn't ask me about the ending, but
that's okay.
That's the whole.
So you're in kind of a unique position that not a lot of authors are in. And just in general, a lot of authors have told me that they write something and they never read it after it's out there. And you're in this unique position where you're having something published again. And it's 10 years later. And I was curious if you read it again. And also, how you feel about the book now, as opposed to how you felt about it when it came out. If anything has changed, your feelings about the book, your feelings about how it's going to be perceived, your feelings just in general, anything you want to say about it.
Yeah, I haven't reread it. I haven't reread it since 2010 when I signed off on the final edit.
Amazing.
And I think I might reread it. Because looking for a couple of different, somebody mentioned a section to me. I'm like, oh, that's right, that's in there. And I went and I found it. I'm like, oh, and I'm going to read part of that tonight. But I think that I was really nervous about it coming out again in some ways. I've gone through all different anxieties about it coming out again. I mean, one is how relevant is it, to this moment in time, the things that I was writing about that, there's a lot of stuff about gentrification. There's a lot of stuff that prefigures Black Lives Matter. There's a lot of stuff that has to do with food politics taken to an incredible extreme. Do you know what I mean? There's all sorts of things in there that I think now have become so normalized and understood. The question is, does it still hit in the same way? You know, like what is the impact about that? And so far what I've seen is that I think the sense of like sort of the sense of like electric dread that was part of the initial thing that made it feel, I think, more dystopian to people at the time. It doesn't feel that way anymore. I mean, like one of the big differences, it may have mass market appeal because, and for all the sad reasons that we know, these things have become very ubiquitous, a lot of them. So I don't know if that means that the book has a different kind of tension than I saw it as before. And so I can't see what that'll be. I think for me, I looked at the stuff around race. I've looked at the stuff around all sorts of politics, because, you know, we've had nothing but a deeply political discussion in this country for years and years and years. And it was one that I have been having in my head for, you know, my entire adulthood. So some of it is just sort of like, I was there years ago. And then there's other ones that, you know, I think the book, I was nervous about some of the stuff coming up because when the book first came out, one of the things that was strange to me was people were always talking about bombs, and they were talking about dystopia, and they were talking about all those things. And I would frequently say to people, what about race? It's in there too, you know, and it was never mentioned. I never had anybody on a podcast or in a, you know, talk about race. And I remember having this meeting with an HBO person, and I was like, well, instead of the bombs, you could focus on this whole other thing. And reading it now, it's so loud. And some of it's uncomfortable and some of it's not, you know, because Della is smart enough as a character to know and viciously lampoon, you know, racism on liberal racism, exoticizing and all of these other things. But she's still intricate. She's still in it. She's still like right to the edge of it, and not enough to know she is, and not enough to know how to get out, not enough to know how to really locate out. And so there's a lot of like, when I was writing into those spaces, and it was very uncomfortable to write into those spaces, and I was writing into them 11, 12 years ago. And with it coming out now, part of me wonders, like, is like, on the one hand, a lot of the discussions in there are discussions that are kind of everywhere right now. A lot of the investigations of like white guilt or whiteness or, you know, all of those. But on the other hand, I wonder, in a time where there's a lot of lack of nuance, how a character can be perceived who's still struggling with some of those things. And I don't know. And I saw, so we looked through things when we did the edit, you know, we just did a pass over them. And another thing, there were a couple of things that came up about queer culture, which sort of the needle had moved on, but like at the time when I wrote it, it was totally fine. In fact, ZAZEN had a lot of trans and queer following, probably 50% from what I saw, just really, really strong showing from that audience. But so I changed a couple of things in that to sort of match. And then one thing I didn't change, where I was like, nope, not changing that. And that was there's a character in there named Mirror, who uses the F word, you know, but she's a gay woman who is completely imprinted on and idolizes gay men from a certain time period. And she has prints of Tom of Finland all over her house. And she's just like, and she uses, you know, she uses the word faggot and to talk to her other gay friend. And it's only between the two of them. It's not ubiquitous in the rest of the book. And, you know, that was one we discussed. And I was just like, that is her character. It's who she is. She is using it in this term. She is like deeply embedded in gay male culture of a certain period that uses this regularly. So that's when I kept in. There was another place where there was a moment where Della's looking at somebody who's transitioned, and she didn't it's the first time she's seen the person since they transitioned, and she only knows the old name. And there's a paragraph where she's starting to shift her pronouns as she's starting to come to terms. But the name was in there, and we pulled the name because dead naming has a very different, impact now in the way that it's talked about than it did at the time. So for me, if that had been a major part of the book, or that had been a part of, if that had been a part of a discourse in the book that was continuing in a lot of ways, I would have dug in and gone there.
Mm-hmm.
But it was an in passing thing, and to cause any unintended harm with an in passing thing was not worth it.
Mm-hmm.
But those were the kind of things I had to look at. We didn't make that many changes. We made very few, but it's definitely a combination in the book. There's a lot of hyperbole and nuance and bombast and obsession. And so the language goes in a lot of different ways. So those were the things I was worried about and have been worried about. I am surprised at how, can I read a section?
Yes, absolutely.
I was really surprised. So this is a session I read actually last night, and I had forgotten about it, and somebody read it back to me, and I was like, oh, I wrote that. So, but this, I was surprised reading it, how intense it felt reading it in front of a crowd. This is a section of the book where there's two unarmed young Black men who've been shot by the police. And it's at the funeral. The funeral for the boys would start at the church around 3 p.m. and would be followed by a procession to the cemetery. After the eulogy, some community members were going to speak. Then everyone was supposed to march to the Roseway Bridge and throw flowers in the river near where the boys were found. There had been chaos earlier in the morning where the city had revoked the permit to march. They said it was all because of the bombings and the threats, and that it was a matter of public safety. The streets around Higher Ground of Africa Baptist were packed with people. It took me 20 minutes to make it through a block. Credence saw me and held out his hand and pulled me through the crowd to where he was, inside the church. He was about to say something when a chorus of shouts deafened us. Over the shoulders of the congregation, I saw a man with stained glass light on his face gesturing at the ceiling. He waved his arm across the crowd and then brought it back to his heart. I thought for sure he would catch fire. I almost heard the hissing of wet wood. The crowd outside began to move and the choir started up. People by the doors were telling us to get back, and the ushers were lined up on either side of the main entrance. Through the side door, I could see them carrying out the coffins. People gathered around the pallbearers in front of the church. The coffins looked like driftwood in an eddy, and I thought the crowd wasn't going to let them through. But then the two hearses drove slowly towards the mass of people, and the crowd parted. Still, while the pallbearers slid the caskets into the back of cars, and silent until each car door had slammed. Then a roar went up and the hearses began to roll down the street and people closed back around us. We passed the church and a torrent of bodies poured out onto Heritage Avenue. At the cemetery, the crowd split into two columns and peeled off. I could see the statue of the mermaid in the garden by the older graves where I'd called the bomb threats in only the night before. Someone next to me was talking about the latest police reports and how a concussion grade went off somewhere behind me. Something was wrong. People with bullhorns were trying to keep the crowd together, but the roar was building and riot cops were coming down the hill in formation. A bottle sailed over the divide between them and us and shattered, and then another, and the shiny black birds, they beat their plastic wings. Clattering, they hit their shields, clattering faster and faster until they broke and charged the crowd. And the march exploded into slivers under impact. It was more than a riot and more than a funeral. It was a conjunction of both grief and fear, fueled by the bombs and the media cycling, the combustion all around us. People were getting pushed forward towards the promenade on the river, and I saw more bottles come down near cops. One cop got hit and the bird crickets fell like a pack on the person who was running up the hill. Tear gas was fired randomly in the crowd. A concussion grenade went off right beside me. When I got up, I couldn't hear anything out of my left ear, and a man who'd been talking to Credence earlier stopped to see if I was okay. I asked him if he'd seen Credence during that, and he said that they'd probably stayed up by the church, and then he picked up a 40-ounce bottle that was near my feet and hurled it. Run, he said, and I did. Rubber bullets whistled by and blasted bark off trees. As I ran, I could feel my blood vessels swell and my heart beat like it was underwater. I was halfway back up the hill before I realized no one was following me, and I just kept walking. 3 blocks, concussion grenades still went off in the distance, but only 3 blocks from the cemetery. The day was filled with normal Sunday sounds. A little boy played in the yard of a partially remodeled house, balancing on a rock a can of Jasco and knocking it off again. Everywhere on Colony of Elect Boulevard were kids and sun wheels spinning in the breeze, hearty blonde neighbors helping each other out. The dawn of compassion had come. Suffering had ended. There were traffic circles and recycling bins. At one point, the trees broke, and I could see the river again. Puffs of tear gas, like a gentle mist, appeared then dissipated along the promenade. And I think that that's an experience that like a lot more people have had in the last 5 years, right? Frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I read that book, 10 years ago, and in rereading it recently, I'm like, how prescient was this novel? Like, it's an experience that we've all heard about now, if not experienced, and it stunned me, really. And you were saying last night that at your live event, you asked people, how many of you felt like this was dystopian fiction, because you never felt like it was fiction. It was something that you knew. And it feels like you knew before a lot of us did what the world is really like. Or maybe just, where I am, we had no idea that's what the world is really like.
I think that, yeah, I mean, I think of it as a figurative novel, not a dystopic novel. But I know why it was seen as a dystopic novel and why it was marketed. I understand all of those things, but for me, it was always figurative, which was Della's a character who sees this happen. This is the world she sees, and she needs language for it. And that language forms the book, the world of the book. But that language, Colony of the Elect is the same boulevard as Heritage Avenue. And that is the main drag along which things are gentrifying in the book. So she has 2 names for them, right? Because to her, that's what she's describing, so everything is named for a reason and a purpose. But I think that, I'd had experiences in police riots before. I'd had experiences understanding, not understanding at the level of the emotional experience of African Americans, but understanding consciously as somebody who's been aware of violence against Black and brown people for a long time, how all those things were there, and there in a way that is there alongside. I think when I wrote ZAZEN, the part that was really driving me crazy was the sense that things like that could live side by side, and one side was not aware of it. And that felt like a madness to me. And it wasn't just race. It was a lot of things, there's a lot about capitalism, as you said. There's a lot about just the drive for identity. So I don't know. It's just going to be interesting to see how people read it now, particularly people who've not come to it. Does a completely other thing come out of the book? That's the thing about books, is you can read them one way. And I had a friend who said, the first time I read ZAZEN, it was just like kind of harrowing, and I was just barreled through it. The second time I read it, I realized it was a comedy. And there's a lot of humor in it, and a lot of it you can't read the first time, You can read it when you're no longer sort of dragged into this story of what might happen, then it becomes more obvious. But I don't know what else could emerge from the relationship between the reader now and the book. Hopefully I'll get to find out, but it is strange to read from something that you wrote a long time ago. For sure.
I imagine it must be. And also, ZAZEN was published by a very small press. And your second novel, The Great Offshore Grounds, which was published last year by Knopf and was longlisted for the National Book Award, which is amazing. they're a large publisher, and I was wondering, what the difference in experience was, being published by a small publisher versus a large publisher, how things are. And also, I'm just going to keep piling questions on. What was it like to have a book come out during a pandemic?
That part was no fun. I can honestly say that I felt like I received the same artistic sensibility and care and respect from my big publisher as I did from my small publisher. I felt incredibly fortunate from that.
Yeah.
I did not feel I never felt any pressure in the editorial process to do anything I didn't want to do, or to ever dumb the book down, or ever, I just didn't experience that. Like, it wasn't there. So I think my experience was very intellectually intimate and generative, and that's exciting. It's exciting to work with people who actually care enough to want to be in the smaller questions of a book, which nobody's got time for that. You know what I mean? Like, it is a real sign of care. There is a very big difference in terms of, it's not print on demand. So, you don't get the lovely glossy colors and things that stick together. But no, and the other thing was the object. The object was gorgeous. The cover, like, everything was done with this, like, really, really careful eye. And so I just felt very taken care of. Now, coming out in a pandemic, it wasn't just coming out in a pandemic. My mom was like, well, said something, how was the book really? I'm like, how do you think it is coming out in a pandemic when the bookstores are closed? Because it came out, Offshore Grounds came out when the bookstores were closed, like they were closed.
Right.
And everybody was still on, the only thing you knew was whatever's on the front page of the website. And there's a lot of things happening on that front page. And it was 2 months after George Floyd. It was also several months, the gear up to the 2020, election cycle. And it was also, it was just one of those, very, very intense time period to even be mentioned in that world. So that was hard in the sense of, like, it's just hard to sell books when the bookstores are closed. I mean, you come back to, you want to say all these deep things, but then you come back to it because, like, it's hard to sell books when the bookstore's closed. And given that, I think everybody was really supportive and really worked hard to try to think creatively about how to get the books out there. And, I think it was also, I got lucky with the award, nomination. And that probably allows me to live another day in the publishing world, quite honestly. But no, it was good. It was good. I know a lot of people have really, really, really hard stories from this past year, and that almost everybody sold really, really poorly. And the problem is those numbers get held against us in the business. Even when everybody knows, they all know it's a pandemic, that works for a couple of us, and other people get dropped, or I get dropped, somebody else get, you know what I mean? So I just consider myself fortunate, and very earnestly so, that, that's not what I'm worried about right now. That, following all of that, they decided to put out ZAZEN and put it out on Vintage, and, like, continue to sort of show that I have a home there. And so that's a lovely thing to be able to say. So I feel good about that.
That's
And I'm
great.
going to pretend the corporation is not over there. I'm going to stay with my editors and my agent and my friends. I'm going to have my tin hat. And,
yeah. So I think John is going to come visit us again.
Oh, that's right.
Hi,
Hello,
John.
yes. It is Q&A time. We do have one question in the Q&A box so far. So if you have a question for Vanessa Veselka this evening, please feel free to submit them on another one that's coming.
Emily Pullen.
But we will. We've got a lively Q&A box, so please continue to feel free to submit your questions.
Okay, you want to start? I see Emily Pullen, David Carr. I know a couple of those names.
The first question from a viewer is going back to the you mentioned earlier. What was the other not ZAZEN first novel that wasn't? If you're comfortable talking about it.
Yeah, it was the very first short story I did was a story called Il Duce, and it was a character I'd played around with, and as an exercise, I had she was, young and traveling on her own young, something that I have a lot of experience with. So I think in some ways had more of a biographical, autobiographical feel, because I hadn't really engaged fiction yet. Like I just wasn't, this was my very first stuff. And what happened was I took her back as a character, I aged her back to a time before she was like kind of obnoxiously confident, into a point of like real social vulnerability, which in her case was about 13, where she was like having sex with 30-year-olds, 25-year-olds. And sort of existing, yes, I know, that's the face you should make. Existing in this very adult, very non-adult world simultaneously, and what she sees in the world. And by taking her back to that point of fragility and like really vulnerable, the deep vulnerability, I really opened something in that character. I think it's a very classic story in some ways, but to say it's a coming of age story, it's a coming of age story, I mean, in its way. But it worked for me, and I understood something about it. I think I had always thought, well, that's the character I've done sketches of. I'm gonna write about that 15-year-old runaway, but find characters I care about. I was never interested in writing about me. I still really feel conflicted writing about me. Like I have written 5 nonfiction pieces, and each one I've had editors say, we need a little more of your story. Can you put a little more of yourself in? And I have sort of like gritted teeth done that. And I feel like they've been good pieces, but it is always the thing I don't really want to write about. So I was starting to just sketch out scenes. And what's interesting is I can go back now. I think I have maybe a chapter I tried. I can go back now and I can actually see elements of Della's voice in there that was completely like, and it was part where I was just free writing something and the anger came out about it. And it had this like rhythm and pace and this, and it's funny, I look back now and I see that. So it was meant to be, more of a, Bildungsroman kind of thing. And with sketchy young women. And I got to use a little bit of the traveling parts that I think I would have done in that same sort of essence of being indigent in offshore grounds on some of the trips.
Thank you. Emily writes, do you see your novels in color or in black and white? I ask because I found my first staff pick blurb, quote, Vaselka's paragraphs are like black and white photographs, stark relief, high contrast, breathtaking evocative images. You find one of these paragraphs and you just want to read it over and over again.
Boy, that's really, really, really kind. There is something to the starkness, particularly in certain works, that I think about visuals quite a bit when I write. And I think there's a kind of constant awareness of the barometric pressure in my writing, where I like in a chapter or place, I would know like how dense is the air, I think there is a way that I think in a kind of chiaroscuro way, so I don't really know how to answer it past that, but I can say that I'm very, very particular at the line level in what I write. and it may not be, that does not mean other people like it, but I am very particular. I spend a lot of time very particular in how something is made at the paragraph level, at the line level, and how I hear it. So I think a lot sonically, and then in terms of visuals, I think more like white, gray, and black, brown with some bands of blue. That's kind of the gold. There's a little bit of gold, so I can't say it's all that. But
thank you. We have time for one more question. There's no more questions in our little box. So Liberty, I might turn it back over to you, perhaps for one more question for this evening.
Oh, sure. Although this is kind of like a broad question, it might take up all the rest of our time. But, in rereading ZAZEN, I found that I'm a lot less optimistic about the future than I was when I read it 10 years ago. Yeah. And I was wondering how you feel about the future.
Well, I would say that I never expected things not to burn. As things really begin to slide very visibly in the country, I would say that, frankly, 2013 till now was like a sort of constant pressure that way. When the more of the political shifts came up, when there was more rioting, when there was, pre-COVID, but then COVID, like all of those kinds of things, I actually went through myself a bit of a relaxing, because my interior matched the exterior. And I felt a lot less anxiety or need to sort of like, yell, there's a fire, there's a fire. You know what I mean? It was kind of like, oh, everybody else sees the fire too. That's
right.
And it felt different that way. I think in terms of hope and I really go back to, over and over again, I listen to people, sometimes they are already dead and I'm reading them, who lived in incredible times. Whether or not your river valley situation, is about to be wiped out forever, or your planet is about to be wiped out, for human life for a period of time, the emotional lived experience is actually the same. If your total world is about to get wiped, being decent becomes a holy act, in the face of those things. And I think that there is something I come back to again and again, is we don't know. I think there's a real, and one of the things I think in particular the left does is we're very invested in being the ones who know. Very invested in knowing exactly what this means and exactly how this plays out, exactly how to fix it, right? And there's a lot of like, we don't know that's going to come. So I don't feel like I'm any less hopeless than I was when I wrote ZAZEN. I don't know that that's a great, like measure of joy, but I think I'm more hopeful. I think I understand some things I didn't understand then. And I think that, the more people are together in the same experience, the more possibilities there are in certain ways. And you never know what actually sets something off. But I definitely don't think it's going to be, when I sit there and try to construct, okay, if you take this policy in this place or this people or this small revolution or this, how do you get to transnational capitalism? Like that, you don't in that way, like not really. So solving it that way, I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry. Whenever I get asked questions like this, I start to think about it, and then I realize, like, oh, I'm just thinking, and people are watching me think. So that's not very interesting. But no, I did notice the sadness in the room the other night when I read. That was what was so remarkable to me. Was that there was just real sadness, and I think that so it showed me how many people are. And then one of the women in there, I really appreciated it. I said, "So does it feel worse?" And she said, "No. If it's better, it feels alive.
Mm-hmm.
It just feels alive, And I think that's kind of how I feel too in a lot of ways. And for me, it feels less lonely because this is how I saw things so for a while. So there is something, validating in a way you don't really want anything validated. When people are like, "Oh, it's so prescient," I'm like, "I'm sorry." That's sort of how I feel when people say that. But yeah, it's always prescient. That's a thing.
There's a question. We have one more question. Maybe we can end with this one. David writes, do you think of yourself as a satirist at all? This book is so ruefully funny. I can't help but not think of it as satire. This was my first read, for whatever that's worth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's an enormous amount of satire in the book. I think that Della is brutally satirizing people around her. And she satirizes them by their intentions, which I think is what makes it very sharp in some ways. And I think it's very close to the naming that she has. Is naming things is also transfers into how she names things she sees as also a satire. So there's an enormous amount of satire in it. And I haven't, it's funny, in Offshore Grounds, I can't think of any satire that's in it at all. I don't think there is any. But it was so natural in ZAZEN. It really felt right for her character and for her way of trying to describe and interact with the world. So I don't know if that means I'm a satirist. I'm not sure I could say I'm a satirist. I've committed satire. So clearly I have that tendency, but I don't think it's in everything I write. I think it's only in ZAZEN.
Thank you. Well, of course, you can purchase ZAZEN at the link in the chat from Literati Bookstore, also in the description below if you're watching us later on YouTube. But Vanessa Veselka, Liberty Hardy, thank you so much for joining us this evening on At Home with Literati. I hope we can have you both in the store at some point in the not too distant future. But until then, I hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great evening, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
You guys both.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
you.